Adrienne Bonnington is a Senior Environment Information Analyst at Horizons Regional Council in the Manawatu, Palmerston North, Wanganui area of the North Island, and has over 20 years of experience in the geospatial industry. And she has a Masters in Information Science, and she is a member of our ISO TC211 International Review Group, and very much appreciated too, Adrienne, for your contributions. And she's also involved with the Association of Local Government Information Managers and their Linked Data Working Group. And her current work involves solving interoperability issues using the semantic web. And as built on the program, Adrienne works with Sean, and Sean is famous for Land and Water Aotearoa. I'm not going to say anything more, Sean, that's fine. Would you please welcome Adrienne and Sean? Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Sean from Horizons Regional Council. As Alistair said, we're going to talk about the nice applications that have been developed. Well, Adrienne will talk about the nice things. I'm going to talk about the old and the ugly. I'm going to talk about where we've come from and how we've got here as a regional sector. We've had to start with the XML view of the world, and we don't deal, well, I haven't dealt with the JSON view of the world, or the linked data or the semantic web. But that's where Adrienne will actually talk about the more interesting things. But I thought it was useful just to provide a bit of background regarding what the regional sector has done over the last 9 years to try and bring environmental data to all of New Zealand. There are 16 regional authorities in New Zealand covering the country. Back in 2009, there was significant government pressure around where was the value and what the regional sector was doing. So they decided to get together and present what they were doing in the environmental space, and through that came the development of this tool, this website called LAWA. Now, this particular project had to take a very pragmatic approach to actually getting delivery. There was very little to no money. There was no methodology. We had to use what we had, how we had it. We didn't have the time to go and try and get the best quality result. We just had to deal with the information we had at hand. And then we needed to demonstrate what value then did it have to the people of New Zealand. This project is still running after 9 years. There is a very strong governance framework, governance we referred to earlier on today. The biggest thing we had to overcome initially was the fiefdoms that exist across the regional authorities. The regional authorities were established to deal with their patch of ground. They didn't worry about what was over the boundary. Looking at things from a New Zealand perspective, we needed to effectively dissolve the boundary and look at things from that national perspective. So any method we chose needed to dissolve those fiefdoms, and that's where the strong governance framework came in. This was very much more of a stick than a carrot. As part of the decisions that were made very early on in terms of data exchange, once the cost of data exchange and pulling things together to provide a national picture was real to the regional councils, we went through a process of compiling water quality data across New Zealand, analysing it for state and trend, and then providing that to a hosting company to put up on the web. That was a very expensive process, taking things from 16 agencies, all doing things differently, all delivering data in the best way that they saw fit. And that was a very time-consuming process. So very early on in the piece, there was a decision made to actually adopt some standards to exchange data with. And we figured it was actually best going to, rather than inventing our own, and coming up with some sort of New Zealand standard, let's leverage what the international community has already done. And so that's where standards have provided an effective tool to actually remove boundaries between organisations and remove the power of some of these fiefdoms, and have built towards having a national picture of our data. But we're missing an Oxford comma in there somewhere. No one standard rules for us, we just use what works. in this perspective. Within the regional sector, how we thought things would work is we would have each council set up their own individual system and then deliver data using some sort of common data exchange language, and we could do that for each environmental domain that we were trying to report on. The first domain we did this for was in the area of water quantity, where we implemented or looked at using OGC standards around Water ML2 and SOS version 2 to do the querying. This was a fraught process. There were, at the beginning of this process, there might have been 3 councils with the capability to deliver this data. Because we had a stick versus carrot approach, we made everyone else implement systems that could support the international standard. And because it was an international standard, they could have their choice about how they did it. So we didn't dictate what they used, we just dictated how they had to deliver stuff. So we went through a multi-year program of helping councils implement these systems and use these standards, and providing the justification for them doing that. Through the fact that we had a very strong governance framework which incorporated the chief executives and the chairs from all the regional councils and unitary authorities. So that became a very effective mechanism to move, to create change. So today we have 16 regional agencies that have these time series data exchange systems in place that support international standards. So conceptually, that's how it should all work. So as a bit of a drill down, with the 16 agencies, with the data servers and with the data requests, using SOS2 and WaterML, that's kind of how it's supposed to work, delivering to one endpoint. At this stage, that one endpoint is the LAWA website, www.lawa.org.nz. That website currently holds all the business logic to deal with the variations between organisations in terms of how they're populating the elements within those standard containers. There are different systems at play. Hilltop with their Hilltop server, Kistas for a few councils, and 52 North has another delivery system. And they all kind of implement the standards in subtly different ways, and LAWA needs to be able to deal with that. And so the business logic has been built into the LAWA website itself, which is an issue, because what we really want is for this information to be effectively reused beyond LAWA, in fact used by the citizen every day. So this is the LAWA website. As it currently stands, there's a new module being released this summer around Can I Swim Here, which will have forecasting information around E. coli and cyanobacteria and things like that. But in implementing these standards through councils, what we're in fact doing is implementing a discipline. What we're trying to do is get rigour into our organisation so stuff can be done repeatedly, reliably and robustly in an ongoing fashion. And the idea is that as we improve what we do, sort of applying the Deming cycle, we get to chalk standards underneath what we're doing and then move ourselves up the gradient. Gradually getting an improvement of how our organisations actually do things so the data becomes more robust and more reliable and can be reused. So this process for us has been one about getting more discipline within our own organisations to collect and deliver what we need to. Which brings us to the more interesting piece, which is what Adrienne is going to discuss next. It's after LAWA. LAWA was just talking about one point, and it used those ugly XMLs and REST calls to pull the data through, and you had to be very capable across a number of different systems, and you're required to understand how they all worked and what all their differences were. What we really wanted was a single point of access. Then anyone could hit and then use. So that is by way of introduction to Adrienne, who will come and talk about the nice stuff.
Right, thanks, Sean. So I'm Adrienne Bonnington from Horizons Regional Council, and basically, I'm here to talk about the environmental integrated data infrastructure. Now, this project came about for a number of reasons, lots of very, very good ones, but basically it was a collaboration effort between multiple agencies, central government agencies, as well as for this particular proof of concept for regional councils. And the objectives were looking at brokering a solution. So as Sean mentioned in his post-LAWA conceptual diagram, is looking at some way we could actually look at all those data sources and broker them through a common platform that we could actually get something harmonised out of it. Obviously underpinned with standards, that was the highest priority because LAWA set the standard. So, and we wanted to obviously use standards because we didn't want to end up having to do this all over again. We knew that using standards was going to future-proof our data. So we wanted to use common terms so that we reduce the complexity for actual users so that they didn't get confused with terms. Data discoverability, that's something that I think generally as councils we're not particularly good at anyway. We open our data but no one really knows where to get it from or how to access it. And obviously the nice stuff at the end of it, some data analysis, query and reuse is of course a bonus as well. Right, okay, so basically when we looked at dealing with the system, we identified a commercial solution that using the linked data approach as a way of the architecture that we could actually use this for the e-IDI proof of concept and based on the objectives. So when we looked at the data sources, this is just a summary of the kinds of data sets that we were looking at. What Sean was talking about with the LAWA data, we were looking at real-time data river measurements for flow and stage. So that was the XML feeds that came from each site, and that was obviously in Water ML2. And we identified 4 different councils because some of them actually ran Kistas and some ran Hilltop, so obviously disparate systems. We also pulled in water management zones based on our use cases, and that all that information is available on resources at the end of the slide session. River monitoring sites, which basically were generated as WFS, and that was basically static data. So we did have some statistical information held against the flow for those sites for annual mean averages and so forth like that. So that kind of information was useful for building our use case. Metadata was an interesting one. Basically that was supplied manually using XLS spreadsheets. So, and I'll talk about that in a minute. We pulled in stats information for regions, so the boundaries between the various regional councils, as well as mesh block data. MFE also we pulled in the river environment classification data set as well, and that was in CSV format. To standardise the data, we wanted to obviously map those attributes that we had across the data sets to ISO standards. So obviously the one for ISO is looking at 19156 or observation and measurements. But because basically that was already covered with using SOS and Water ML2, we were able to easily map that to SOSA. So that's using W3C's standard. Also, for when it came to units of measurement, because we wanted to use something that was authoritative or already out there and well used, we used QUDT, which is basically scientific and engineering units of measurement. So that was the vocabulary that we used for that. When it came to monitoring sites, it was a little bit trickier because there wasn't any standards that covered it because it was basically operational. So it was very much utilised for the use within the council environment at an operational level. So we ended up using the NEM standard, which is the National Environment Monitoring Standards, that we ended up pushing into a registry, and also used GeoSparkle, Geo, schema.org and QUDT as well. So as you can see, even though we're sort of wanting to apply standards, we have this kind of national conceptual level, but then also an operational localised level. Okay, so this diagram here basically showed you a bit of an how linked data works in the sense of subject, predicates and objects. So if we have a look here, you can see my cursor there. We've got flow, so the flow site being a particular identifier. We have the predicate, and we're using SOSA here, has feature of interest, and that links to the measurement site. Now, because linked data is quite powerful in the sense that you can on-link to other data sets, we could then go and actually have a look at the site information for that model based on another data set. These ones here, the observation itself, we could actually link to an observation definition. We have some information regarding concatenation for a label, for viewing, making it easier use for users. And we've got NEMS term for water flow level, which goes to an actual description, so at least when the user's looking at the data, they know exactly what they're looking at and the context that they want to use it in. And obviously there's a result here that then can actually on-link to more information, being the particular value and what unit of measurement that happened to be in, which was in cubic metres per second, and that actually goes on to explaining what that means exactly. So you're actually looking at a little bit more semantic information regarding what flow, this particular flow data actually means. Now, just linking now to what the site information had about it, this is how we interlinked to other data sets. So we had site information, which was static data that was being produced in WFS. We had the feature of interest. We ended up using the actual NEMS information or glossaries to actually determine what these terms meant. So we had things like catchment, reach, which we on-linked to the REC data set, which is the one that was supplied by MFE. So that gives you an idea of how we actually interlink the data. So it's almost like multi-dimensional data sets. The metadata was the fun stuff. Generally, I hate to say it, as councils, we don't do metadata that well. And it tends to be left to proprietary software, and whether that's based on a particular standard or framework. A lot of councils do use the ANZLIC profile, but as we know, that's been superseded with ISO. So what we end up doing is looking at a metadata profile. We map that to vocabularies, and we obviously based it on ISO 19115. But we found that there were some things that it didn't cover, so we ended up pulling in other standards as well for data quality. And when it came to access, we ended up having to use things like void, which is specific to linked data sets, because you're actually looking at how you can access the endpoints for that. So as you can see here, we've got quite a number of vocabularies so that we could make up our standardised profile. We've got Dublin Core, we had some own terms, things like for contact email and so forth. ADMS, which is an asset, it's a digital asset management system that uses it for looking at data assets. DCAT, DQV, which is data quality. Metadata actually pulled some of the links from CSIRO, had some elements that were described on the SeaGrid site, and we used void as well, which I mentioned was specifically for linked data. For flow and stage, that was an interesting one because we actually had metadata within the feed itself that was extracted when it was processed at the brokering system, and then also we could augment that with other metadata elements as well. So we were able to automate some of that because obviously that's real time, so we could actually pull that out, and those were the vocabularies we used for that. For vocabularies, this just shows you how we map them. Basically the title, which we know is an element for ISO, these are the ones here. We've got topic categories, which was used from the code list. So the ISO standard actually has a code list for various topics. We use the ISO codes for country when it came to language. And so that's how we were sort of quite implementing ISO standards into the metadata as well as utilising the metadata elements. This one down here, we ended up pulling in the quality code, and we used the OGC quality codes like QC600 and so forth. There's a code list that OGC uses, and we applied that, and we do that for our hydrology data anyway, and that was based on ISO 19157, which is the data quality standard. So that was just an example of some of the elements that we used. At the end of the day, we were able to produce through the brokering system this tool where basically it's the service that is provided by the vendor. It's like a registry where you can actually access the data. This is available now because it's a proof of concept. It's available to the 30th of March next year. There's a Sparkle endpoint you can access. You can download the data in various formats like JSON, XML, and various other formats as well. So by all means, go and have a look at that site. You can search for information, and it's themed, categorised, and the NEMS glossary is at the site as well. We also had visualisation as part of the proof of concept. This shows you the link to the actual Shiny app that shows you data that we pulled across the 4 regions. And this way we could actually pull in data from, so we've got real-time data, so that's the XML feed, and that comes up in this particular area here. We've got a hydrograph, and we've got other information that's actually live or coming through every 15 minutes. This is from the Horizon site. We've got site data, so that's coming from our WFS feed, and we've also got rec data. Okay, so that comes from, so we're starting to look at things that are a little bit more interoperable, and particularly for across 4 councils. So potentially we can escalate that to 16 that we have. The visualisation part of this tool as well is that we, for grins, this just showed you a graph that basically looks at a site in Canterbury, Waikato, at Horizons, which is Manatū Wanganui area, as well as Hawke's Bay Regional Council for that particular time series, and we can actually download that too as a CSV. So now we're starting to kind of see, wow, interoperability actually works, and standardisation works too. And we've also got the ability to search across all those sites for various keywords and so forth, so we can actually find what we're looking for. So it might be a particular reach, it might be all of the Manawatu, or it might be all of Wanganui. So that makes it so much easier. Okay, implementing standards, it is hard. We identified that basically we've got to have capability in pretty much these areas to have an understanding of how we can actually integrate all this information. So we're not just dealing with ISO, as you could see with vocabularies, we're dealing with W3C, and we're dealing with OGC as well. So very, I suppose, few people operate in this space, but we might end up having more sort of in outer areas. So we did it. The proof of concept, it's there, it's available. These are the actual endpoints. So we've got a Sparkle endpoint that you can actually access. We have more information from the MFE site regarding the whole project, including information on the use cases and requirements. And if you go to that site, you'll also see those lovely videos as well, if you're wanting to see those all the way through. And that's pretty much it. So any questions?
Yes, it's question time. And 3 speakers have given you an insight to some of the contemporary things that are happening here in New Zealand. In the science area, it's this is really significant, I think. It's time for just reflect on what Alistair had to say, and Sean and Adrienne just now. Just any top of mind questions to.
I guess this is mostly for Sean. You were talking on getting the standardization on such across all the various councils and such. I guess I'm just curious a little bit more about that. The role of building a community of practice that can agree on the standards seems to be a very key element. You know, building your community first, and then you can get there. I wondered if you could comment on how that process went for you and how the community was built.
How was it built? First, there was one. And in fact, there was a pair. And back very early on, there was an agreement between MFE and the regional sector that would actually use a standard to actually try and simplify some of this data transfer. And because there was an independent agreement outside of the regional sector to use a standard, there was then the basis, at that point it was actually a very easy recommendation for a governance group who had the authority just to say yes. But actually then driving those standards into the organisations required a group of like-minded people. And building that group, it's actually quite easy to find people who are interested, who are captivated by the technology, but actually capable in implementing it and understanding what some of the traps can be. That was a bit harder. We ended up writing a lot of documentation, visiting lots of people, lots of organisations, lots of conversations to try and build. And I spent a lot of time on the phone with vendors, different councils, lots of conversations with governance groups and steering groups. But over a period of time, they began to trust what we did and what we were saying. And so that actually the governance group ended up supporting the community. But without that governance group in place, it wouldn't have happened. Without strong governance, it would have fallen over and failed. Because there was complete buy-in across the sector, and they needed people to drive it. It occurred. Governance.
Sort of question for all three speakers. It's a bit unfair. But I think in each of the presentations we've had, we've seen that the solutions that have delivered have had to really put into effect a combination of standards from a number of different domains. So did those standards sort of fall out iteratively as you worked your way through the problem, or was it a case of trying to map out in advance the architecture and the standards that you would need to use? You know, what was the design process, or was it just a case of finding things that worked?
Yes. There were a mixture. There was a mixture of things that went on. So in some cases, we knew that we had standards that were already in play that could do what we were trying to do. So we picked those to prove them as experimental things. So things like observations and measurements were an example of that. In others, we hunted around for things. So we would do a scan and say what standards are the issue, what standards might help us, particularly for Alfie. That was very much Alfie. We went in with no technical expectations whatsoever. The idea was just to link stuff, and at no point did we say we're going to use the semantic web to do this. It was just, okay, we've got this problem, now how do we do it? And as we scanned across stuff, some candidates fell out, and we ran with them. And others, the soil IE, we knew already there was an argument, so we picked the 5 and ran with those. So
For LAWA, basically we went with what we knew. We had some experience from the geospatial world. A number of the people who were doing this were GIS heads from way back, and they knew about OGC, and they knew about WFS, and they knew about exchanging data between platforms. So that was an obvious place to start. But we took a very pragmatic approach. It was what did we know about at the time? So, and then became very iterative in that respect. But we needed to keep it simple because we're looking at simple, practical, straightforward implementations as well. So we went with what we knew.
For the e-IDI project, we took a similar approach to what Alistair was talking about. Basically, we identified what we actually wanted to portray, particularly with metadata, and we identified some things we're actually missing, things like lineage and request protocols and things that we actually felt was important to add to the metadata. And like I mentioned as well, we had also linked data, Sparkle endpoints and things, which is a little bit trickier to describe, so we used void because I suppose at the end of the day that is what it's used for. But identifying that, we did have the model so that when those things come online and become more standardised, with linked data particularly, it's useful in the sense it's quite flexible because we can remap or we can actually bring those online. So in that regard, yes, we did have some things missing, but we're very much mindful. We do have that in a model that we can say, okay, well, when this comes in and we know there's an authoritative vocabulary that we can apply, we can use it.
Kia ora, I'm Alison. I was part of this project as well. I think it was also that way back when, Sean, I think we somehow agree that we would build for the future. There would be many iterations of the technology, and part of that building for the future was using standards. And we had to have a group of people who were foresighted and stubborn enough to do something that was harder and more expensive to build for the future.
We always knew it was going to be the first step, but it was getting that chock in underneath what we had done and said that's going to be our baseline. And it was good enough for that point in time, but for us was only the beginning of that, and we recognised that projects such as this, with the e-IDIs and etc., are the natural evolution of that.
Kia ora. Kia ora. John here from Stats. I am very interested in this initiative, and I was just wondering, when is it going to become rolled out at a national level if it's been successful, or would you propose that?
Based on this proof of concept, there's been actually quite a bit of interest. It's almost sort of split three ways that Algom's actually looking at funding and so forth to keep the proof of concept going, and there's more momentum sort of being built up in that linked in the local government space. I suppose it's building that awareness that, you know, there is this capability that we don't have to change what's under the hood, so to speak. We can just augment the system with linked data and map to authoritative standardised vocabularies. So yeah, there's moves afoot to actually continue with that work and keep it going.
2 years, 5 years, 10 years?
Hopefully less than that. Yeah.